Coming up next on Another View, the role of television in the civil rights movement. Television brought the protests, the marches, the speeches, and the people front and center in America's conscience. The fight for civil rights became the first televised major domestic news story in the U.S. In this hour, we'll talk with the author of Equal Time, Television and the Civil Rights Movement, about the medium and how it influenced the message. And we'll take your calls at 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. But first, this news from NPR.
Discussing the issues and celebrating the successes of the African American community. This is Another View.
And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. Television, a communications medium that we take for granted in today's technological world. But in the 1960s, television programming was very different. There were 3 commercial networks from which to get your news: ABC, CBS, and NBC. Television literally brought the world into your living room. And in terms of the civil rights movement, as our guest today writes, brought black people, imaginatively at least, into white people's living rooms. Television played a key role in our perceptions of black and white. Joining me to talk about the history is Aniko Badrakuzee, I hope I pronounced that right, but we'll get it straight in a moment. Author of Equal Time, Television and the Civil Rights Movement. Aniko, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you so much for having me on.
Could you, Aniko, pronounce your last name again, please?
Yeah, it's a doozy, and now that it's the beginning of the school year, I find myself doing this in the first class. It's Badrakuzee. Badrakuzee.
Okay. I don't like mispronouncing that, so I apologize. Badrakuzee. Anyway, Aniko, welcome to Another View. Now, you wrote the book Equal Time, Television and the Civil Rights Movement, and I was interested to read in the beginning that this was not your first choice in terms of some research that you were doing.
Well, actually, I originally was doing research, and the first book that I wrote was on the youth movements of the 1960s and popular television. And it was actually doing that research and being really, really interested in the role that television played in the context of the 1960s and the turmoil of that era and the social change movements that moved me to want to look at the civil rights movement, because the youth movements certainly were hugely influenced by the civil rights movement, particularly the Student New Left and the anti-war movement. So, one research project kind of leads to the next, and then I stumbled across the papers of the producer and creator of a late 1960s TV show called Julia, which was the first primetime program to feature an African American in the leading role since Beulah and Amos and Andy from the early 1950s. And I found all these letters that audience members had written to him in these papers, and I was so fascinated by what these viewers, both black and white viewers, were saying about the show that I had to research this more, and that became sort of the impetus for what eventually became the book.
Now, before we talk about Julia, I want to go back and kind of set the stage a little bit for what was going on in the late 50s and early 60s in terms of television. And we have a clip from Amos and Andy that we would like to play first, and then we'll talk on the other side.
Okay.
Yeah, I tell you, fellas, I just don't like this neighbor of mine.
So he really the borrowing kind, huh, Kingfish?
Well, just one thing, Kingfish. You know a lot of people borrow.
Yeah, but not like this fella. He come in and took the vacuum cleaner without even asking.
I didn't know you had a vacuum cleaner, Kingfish.
Oh, sure. I borrowed it 2 months ago from Smith down on the first floor.
Yeah, well, I gotta admit it's pretty bad having people move next to you that's worse than you is.
Oh, yeah. What's that again, Andy?
Well, I know all about this borrowing, Kingfish. A fella moved right across the hall from me last year, and he's always borrowing things. One night he wanted to borrow my car. Well, let him have that, and then he come back and borrowed $5 for gasoline.
Oh, boy, now that's really something.
Yeah, but the payoff was he called back and wanted to know what my gal was doing that night. I tell you something, fellas. When it comes to mooching, there ain't nothing worse than a smooch moocher.
Now, Amos and Andy, that the NAACP was protesting against the perception and what was going on with that show, weren't they?
Right. The early 1950s, this is the early years of television, where television really is new media. And initially, there was a lot of hope in the African American community that television would provide a kind of a better break for the image of African Americans than the film industry and radio, which of course is where Amos and Andy started. Mm-hmm. And so when Amos and Andy came on the air, even though now it was African American actors playing the roles rather than two white men
with blackface,
in kind of blackface, mm-hmm. although that's on the radio, so you don't see them. So it's these black-faced voices. But here on television, obviously, blackface minstrelsy is not going to work. But nevertheless, the concern with the NAACP is that these were demeaning stereotypes, throwbacks to basically the minstrel era, and it was sort of a coincidence that the show premieres the exact same time that the NAACP is having its national yearly convention. Mm-hmm. So it made it easier for the delegates to the NAACP convention to, sort of feel outraged about this and start a campaign, particularly against the sponsor. Most people think that because of the NAACP, that's why Amos and Andy was eventually taken off the air, but it's not really quite that simple. The show did last for 2 full seasons.
But as we moved into the late 50s and early 60s, and as the civil rights movement started to gain momentum, the emphasis, I think, kind of moved away a little bit from entertainment to how news was actually covering the events.
Right. So by 1953, both Amos and Andy and the other primetime show that features an African American in the leading role, The Beulah Show, mm-hmm. About a black maid, those are off the air. And in entertainment television, we have very much a kind of a whitewashed primetime. But of course, particularly starting in 1957 with the integration of Central High in Little Rock, Arkansas, mm-hmm. Which is a huge confrontation, with 9 high school students trying to go to high school, mm-hmm. and meeting a lot of resistance, which eventually leads to President Eisenhower having to call in the National Guard. And television news is really in its infancy at this point, but that becomes one of the first major news stories that the networks start to cover, in part because it's so visually dramatic. So we see the beginnings of both television news as a medium and the understanding that this is a dramatic news story and potentially something that the civil rights movement as it's starting to really come together as a social change movement. The thinking that television is potentially a useful tool that the movement could use, hopefully to its advantage.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as a matter of fact, Martin Luther King said, I believe I'm quoting this from your book, that we are here to say to the white men that we will no longer let them use clubs on us in dark corners. We're going to make them do it in the glaring lights of television. So he clearly understood the power of the visual in terms of getting the message across. Right.
Now, King very rarely was so kind of upfront about sort of acknowledging the power of television and the movement using television, because to do that would, sort of make him and the movement seem a little bit calculating.
But in fact, weren't they calculating?
Yeah. Yes. But, in a way that any movement today, or since the 1960s, since the civil rights period, any movement that wants to reach a national, or at this point a global audience, is going to use whatever communication and media technologies are available to them. But this is the first time that we have a movement using this new form of media communication. And so much of King's discourse and the discourse of the movement was a kind of a moral appeal to the nation. So to be too open about, okay, we want to be able to appeal to this new medium of television news, it could have been seen as calculating. And I think King and the movement were very aware of that. So, yeah, it's an amazing quote, but it's actually a rarity in quotes that you will find of Dr. King.
But Aniko, I'm trying to get a sense of, all right, if these planners and the leaders of the civil rights movement, and they recognize that they have this medium by which that they can get their message out, but what kinds of conversations were they having, or did they have any, with network executives and so forth to make sure that the story they wanted told was actually told?
Oh, none. I mean, basically, because again, well, on the part of TV news producers and reporters, they're trying to be good journalists, and they're trying to be good journalists in a medium that is still not really necessarily respected as a journalistic medium. So all three networks are trying to show that, TV news is as respectable and, viable a journalistic medium as newspapers and news magazines.
And I think that's a really important point to make, because in today's world, television is so much a part of everything that we do. But back then, it really was so new that people did not necessarily look at television journalists as real journalists.
Right. I mean, the civil rights story was one of the key stories, and also just the Cold War. By the early 1960s, television news is spending a lot of time covering Cold War issues. And again, a lot of that, and if you actually look at the news specials and the primetime documentaries, one thing that I've always been struck by is how sober and serious these early examples of television news are. And that also, I think, really works to the advantage of the civil rights movement, because there's, for the most part, nothing sensationalistic about the way that network television is covering these stories. I mean, yes, they clearly the cameras want the dramatic images, because television, of course, is fundamentally a visual medium. But I was so struck doing the research at how serious and sober the coverage tends to be. And one thought experiment I give my students is to sort of imagine our television news environment with 24-hour news and the pundit shows, and to imagine that actually existed in the early and mid-1960s. And would the civil rights movement have been as successful as it was if we had a different kind of TV news regime? And I'm not so sure that the movement would have been as successful.
Mm-hmm. Well, how much do you think the fact that network television was centered in the North and not centered in the South, how much that played a part in terms of their willingness and ability to go out and report this story? Do you think it makes a difference?
Oh, yeah. Even though a number of the key journalists who covered the movement were themselves Southerners, mm-hmm. they tended to be liberal, progressive. But I think the fact that
is that where television gets the liberal bent from the very beginning.
Perhaps
accused of at any rate.
But I think, certainly the television news environment and just I think the mainstream journalism environment in this period where the audience is a mass audience. It's not a niche audience. It's not a partisan audience. The whole philosophy of kind of mainstream journalism is quite different in this period. Mm-hmm. And so you've got the networks trying to show, and also television news is part of a regulated industry. Broadcasting is regulated by the Federal Communications Commission. And so beefing up television news was one way that the networks could show that, they're responding to their public service requirements. But yeah, the fact that the networks are centered in New York City, but I think perhaps what's even more important is what's going on in the political arena. So one of the arguments I make in the book is around issues of, for instance, school integration. Mm-hmm. Well, the Supreme Court has decided on that with the Brown decision. So in covering stories about school integration, whether it's Little Rock or whether it's massive resistance, mm-hmm. both in Virginia and also for a little while it looked like that was going to happen in the Atlanta school system mm-hmm. in Atlanta, Georgia. When the law of the land is schools must be integrated, it makes it much easier for network news coverage to assume that school integration is the appropriate way to go, and any groups and individuals or political figures who are trying to stop it are, they're the ones who have to explain themselves. They're the ones who have to be sort of, interrogated. And similarly with integration and protests against Jim Crow laws, you have the Kennedy administration coming out in favor of integration, and finally Kennedy brings his civil rights bill forward in 1963. So you've got the presidential administration and, I would say probably majorities in Congress supportive of these key goals of the civil rights movement. And the Southern segregationist position is really one that's clearly on the defensive. And yes, you've got Northern news personnel who really don't understand and clearly are not sympathetic to that position. And you've got Southern white segregationists who really don't quite understand how to use this national medium to their advantage, which is very clear if you look at television news coverage.
Well, I wanted to listen to a clip of news coverage on the march in Selma around Bloody Sunday. Let's take a listen to this and we'll talk on the other side.
We've lived with slavery and segregation 345 years. We waited a long time for freedom. We are trying to remind the nation of the urgency of the moment. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time.
The long-anticipated Freedom March from Selma to Alabama's capital of Montgomery finally gets underway as Dr. Martin Luther King addresses the crowd at the starting point. Twice before, the marchers had been turned back by state troopers. Now they march under a federal court order and with the protection of federalized National Guard units and regular troops.
They told us we wouldn't get here. There were those who said that we would get here only over their dead bodies. Well, all the world today knows that we are here and we are standing before the forces of power in the state of Alabama saying we ain't gonna let nobody turn us around.
So they weren't afraid to use Dr. King as a spokesperson in the news coverage.
Oh, yeah. Well, when it comes particularly to the Selma campaign, which I've done a lot of research on, as far as network news goes, in having a spokesperson from the movement, it was King or nobody. Which in some ways works to the advantage of the civil rights movement because obviously King is eloquent and he could speak in tones that I guess would not threaten or turn off the presumed white audience. But of course, the movement was far more complex. It wasn't just Dr. King. It was also, particularly in Selma, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was mostly a student-oriented movement that was a little bit unhappy with King's leadership and with King as so dominant a leader. They were a lot more kind of consensus-driven. But you never heard from members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And you never heard that there were different kind of factions and points of view, which, of course, would muddy the story.
Well, I was going to say, was that a conscious decision then of the civil rights leaders, or was that a conscious decision of the networks in terms of let's make sure we keep the same positioning and the same thoughts around this issue, that we're all marching on the same page, basically? Yeah.
I think with the network news journalists, and I think it's probably similar with other mainstream news outlets, they don't want to tell a really complicated story. With television news, obviously you have very little actual time. So to get into the ins and outs of, intra-movement politics, that just makes things complicated. It actually worked to the benefit of television news to have this one brilliant, compelling spokesperson. There was certainly a lot of grumbling in the movement, particularly by young people. But in the end, I think as far as the key goals for the movement, and particularly with Selma, which was the goal of voting rights and a Voting Rights Act, it helped to have a straightforward story to tell, and to have King as the spokesperson. Keep it simple.
Keep it simple. If you're just joining us, my guest is Aniko, but I'm going to get this name right, I promise. Badrakose. How's that?
Oh, very good.
All right. Author of Equal Time, Television and the Civil Rights Movement. And we're talking about the key role television played during America's fight for equality in the 1960s. If you want to join our conversation, call us at 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. I'm curious to hear from our audience about your remembrance of the coverage of the Civil Rights Movement. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. How did television news change your perception, or did it change your perception of what was going on in the South during that time? 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Aniko, I know you studied the Selma March quite a bit. What kinds of reactions did America have to what they saw in terms of coverage of the march?
Right. Well, there were actually three of them. The first one is the one that got violently stopped. And it's often called Bloody Sunday. It's when marchers, and King was not there that particular day. Marchers attempted to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge to go from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery to highlight the fact that the voting rights for citizens in Alabama, and particularly in Selma, were practically non-existent. And the brutality that the Alabama state police and posse members, drew down on these marchers was quite remarkable. And, of course, television cameras were right there, so you have these images of tear gas and billy clubs and posse men on horseback and screaming. And, I mean, it makes very dramatic, compelling, news film. And that goes out on... Actually, ABC interrupted their Sunday night movie, which was called Judgment at Nuremberg, which just happened to be about the Holocaust and Nazi persecution of Jews in Germany. So you cut from that to these images from Selma, and a lot of political figures then get quoted in the newspaper basically saying this is like Nazi brown shirts in Alabama. And I find a lot of just regular viewers making a similar connection. But one thing I particularly was interested in looking at is the way that Southern white Alabamians were responding to this coverage.
And what were they saying?
We can talk more about that if you want.
Yeah, what were they saying?
Well, you've got these Southern white Alabamians. They're having to confront this national, this national medium, television, portraying their state and race relations in their state, and with most Southern whites, they're living in this worldview where, segregation and, the race relations, it works for everybody. Whites are happy.
Why are you
blacks
sticking
happy.
your nose in our business kind of a thing?
Yeah, and, what's going on here? This is outside agitators, or this is Martin Luther King as a publicity hound. All he wants is publicity. And, never asking, okay, well, yes, clearly Martin Luther King and his movement wants publicity. But these Southern white segregationists can never then go to the next question. Well, why does King and why does this movement want publicity? Because that would require these Southern white Alabamians to ask the fundamental question, which kind of will destroy their worldview, that segregation and Jim Crow works for everybody and everybody knows their place and everybody's basically content with their place. So it's very disconcerting for these Southern white segregationist Alabamians to see this national medium distributing to the nation this image of Alabama that is not an image that these white Alabamians know how to make any sense of.
Because to them, they're not doing anything wrong.
Right. This image doesn't comport with what they think their world is really all about and what relations between black and white are in Alabama. So it's just fundamentally kind of discombobulating. And it's interesting for me to sort of see, and mostly through letters to the editor in newspapers. And also, there's a lot of saying, well, it's northern reporters. They don't understand.
And they don't understand us. Leonard, we've got lots of calls waiting, so let's go to some of them. Leonard joins us from Norfolk. Hi, Leonard. You're on the air.
How you doing, Miss Ham?
Doing great. How are you?
I'm doing great.
Good.
I remember, especially leading up to Dr. King's death, how I'm living in southeast Arkansas, and television sort of brought a civil rights movement to southeast Arkansas that we hadn't seen before. Either the stations that were broadcasting out of Little Rock eliminated it or discreetly edited a lot of the action that was going on, but we didn't get a lot of it until perhaps 1968, something like that. Also of note is that a lot of the coverage of the civil rights movement that took place here in Norfolk, a lot of the television film doesn't exist anymore because a lot of the television stations threw it away. Now, I do know that Channel 3 donated a great deal of its old film archives to the ODU.
To ODU, absolutely.
Yeah, and they're over there sifting through all that stuff. But a great deal of the footage that was taken during the Massive Resistance, especially during the old Duckworth years as mayor here, a lot of the city council sessions, a lot of the marches that took place here in Norfolk, it doesn't even exist on tape, news tape anymore here.
Okay, Leonard, thank you so much for your call. For those who don't know, Leonard Colvin is a reporter with the New Journal Guide, and they've been chronicling the civil rights movement in the Hampton Roads in Virginia and nationally for over 100 years. Annika, you want to respond?
Yeah. Actually, there are two stations, I think one in Roanoke. They could be both in Roanoke. Local affiliates to the networks that have also donated all of their remaining news film, actually to the University of Virginia. And there's a big project at the university to digitize all this material. And I've looked at some of that footage and actually have my students look at it. I didn't know about the station in Norfolk. I think that's
as a matter
really
of fact,
fascinating.
It's the CBS affiliate here, and we actually here at WHRO are going into partnership with Old Dominion University to help digitize that materials and also include the materials in our eMedia VA, which is the digital content that we provide for school children all over the state of Virginia. So that footage is very, very exciting. Yes, for everyone. Renee joins us from Hampton. Hi, Renee. You're on the air.
Hi. Yes. How are you today, Barbara?
Doing good. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Great.
I wanted to find out your views or your take on not necessarily the journalistic coverage of the civil rights struggle, but those individuals who were actually on television and had shows like Nat King Cole and Harry Belafonte and others, what were their contributions in your perception of at least elevating the struggle a little higher? Were they afraid of losing sponsorship, or what were some of the things that you may have observed or known about?
Actually, Renee, we appreciate that question because that's going to take us into the second part of our discussion. Go ahead, Aniko.
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, Nat King Cole in 1957 did have a variety show. The problem was that he could not secure a sponsor. So his network, I can't remember, I think it may have been NBC, actually allowed the show to go on, I think, for a full year with
no sponsorship?
Commercial sponsorship.
Wow.
None.
Would not happen today.
Could not happen today. But the question is, Nat King Cole was a very popular singer, pianist, jazz musician. Mm-hmm. And here, the man cannot secure sponsorship for a nationally televised program. And so that becomes another reason for the networks to say, we can't do this. Even with someone as popular, not just in the African American community, but just, nationally and generally popular as Nat King Cole was. I know Harry Belafonte was and to this day remains very, very involved in civil rights work. He was very involved with Dr. King. He was involved at the March on Washington, but I'm not really aware of anything he was doing in television in this period.
Okay. We have one other call before I want to get into the whole discussion about Julia and Good Times and some of those shows. Trish is joining us from Virginia Beach. Hi, Trish. You're on the air.
Hi, Ham. How are you?
I'm fine.
I grew up in Connecticut, and we hadn't really experienced segregation because I'd never gone to a segregated school. Mm-hmm. But what the news did for me, it was caused me to challenge my teacher. I had a history book that said that the Ku Klux Klan was abolished in 1938. I come home and I look at the news and I say, that's not true. You are lying to me. When are you going to get some textbooks that are relevant?
So the book, the history books and what was actually happening did not match up for you?
Did not match. Absolutely not.
Right.
Okay,
right.
Trish, thanks for the call. Aniko?
Yeah, I mean, it's not that I would not make the argument that television news was giving the truth. It was giving a version of what was going on. Of what was
their perception of the truth.
But yeah, I always want to make clear, it's one of the big arguments I want to make in the book, is that the civil rights movement did not control the message that was going out to, on network television. No social change movement ever really controls, major media organs. So network news, they were doing stories for the presumed middle-class white audience. But I think, ultimately what's so important about the relationship between television and the civil rights movement, to some extent, is just the visibility. Making what could otherwise have been regional, local stories. What's going on in Birmingham? Well, that's the city of Birmingham's issue. That's the state of Alabama's to deal with. What the movement was able to do was to make these issues national, to make Americans around the country concerned enough to put pressure on their elected officials. And so making these issues visible. And in the early to mid-'60s, doing so in a way that really helps the movement. One could, talk further about what happens later in the 60s when the issues turn to the north and to the inner cities, and television, of course, is still covering, the urban riots and all the rest, but in a way that perhaps does not really work to the benefit of African American communities in the North.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you.
That's a whole other issue.
Exactly. I want to ask you before we move to the entertainment side. That's great. It was not until 1963 that the networks actually hired an African American to cover news. So was it difficult for the white reporters and cameramen, and they were cameramen back then, to actually be able to talk to people?
Not that I've been able to see, but then again, you're dealing with white reporters who, again, don't really understand the kind of, the lived experience of being African American, living under Jim Crow in the Deep South. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one reason you get a kind of simplified picture. Again, it would be simplified anyway, just because of television,
time and so forth,
as a news medium.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, there certainly is that issue. And I mean, one thing that I found really interesting, particularly looking at the Selma coverage, is I looked at CBS News's coverage, the Walter Cronkite nightly newscast, and only King ever gets interviewed. None of the marchers gets interviewed. There's no interviews with, black Selma residents. So that may get to a kind of discomfort that white reporters may have.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the entertainment side. There was a show called Julia, and that was one of the shows that actually portrayed African Americans from a middle class perspective. We've got a clip, and then we can talk about it.
Out here tomorrow morning, I'd like to get a look at you.
Yes, doctor. What time would be convenient?
Be here at 9. And make yourself as handsome as you can manage. I'm tired of looking at ugly nurses. I married one.
I'll do my best, sir. But has Mr. Colton told you?
Tell me what?
I'm colored.
What color are you?
I'm a Negro.
You always been a Negro, or you're just trying to be fashionable? 9 o'clock. Try and be pretty.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I guess in one sense it was trying to make the racial issue have more levity rather. But at the same time, wow, that's kind of stunning.
Yeah, and you get a fair amount of that in Julia. I mean, the show was created by a white Hollywood liberal progressive who heard a speech by the head of the NAACP and wanted to do something positive besides just write a check. And Julia is what he came up with. And so we have Diane Carroll playing a nurse. She is a widow, so there's no husband. She has an adorable, precocious 6-year-old son. And they live in Los Angeles. And except for these, for the most part, kind of whimsical, bantering about race and maybe somewhat whimsical moments of dealing with questions of prejudice. What we have in the world of Julia is the kind of colorblind integrationist utopia. Julia lives in an apartment building. All of her neighbors are white. She works in an aerospace health clinic. All of her coworkers are white. And she is fully integrated into this almost completely white world. I mean, she occasionally is allowed to have a black boyfriend. But, it's kind of like this vision of what integration should look like. And what integration should look like is that African Americans are comfortable for white people and are really no different from white people except the color of the skin.
And then we get to good times, and we've only got about 2 minutes left in the interview segment, but we get to good times, and the perception is quite different, isn't it? I don't have time to play the clip, but can you describe a little bit about where that moved?
Yeah, well, there's a backlash against Julia because, this is 1968 when the show comes on. And the argument is this is not realistic. This is not telling it like it is. So then network television kind of flips the other way, and we get all these ghetto sitcoms. And Good Times, I think, is the most successful. We have, in this case, an intact African-American family with a strong patriarch, even though he's often unemployed, but a strong family unit. And it's dealing with some of the, at least in the early years of the series, it's dealing with the kind of the vicissitudes of poverty. Then, unfortunately, the character of the eldest son, JJ, becomes this kind of breakout hit. Your guest may remember him as Kid Dynamite. And then he gets criticized as a throwback to the minstrel era.
There is so much that we could talk about in terms of this subject. It is just fascinating. And actually, audience, if you'd like to hear more, Annika will be here in Hampton Roads next Friday, September the 7th at noon. Oh boy, you're going to have to turn on another view while you're talking. At the ODU University Theater, which is at the corner of 45th and Hampton Boulevard, brought to you by the College of Arts and Letters Colloquium Series. It's free. It's open to the public. And if you'd like to know more about this, come on by and see her, the author of Equal Time, Television, and the Civil Rights Movement. Annika, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be right back. And welcome back. Kids in 2 Norfolk neighborhoods are in love with the game of chess, but the way they're mastering the game is a far cry from what you might expect. Our Lisa Godley recently visited a training session at the Lamberts Point Community Center, where it was evident that you're never too old or too young to enjoy this popular pastime.
Yeah, now that's a good position, having your 2 knights out there. 2 steps over and he closes the door and he's not in danger anymore. Chess, the way we play it, is unlike any other kind of chess clubs you're going to see.
You won't find the quiet surroundings you might expect during these chess lessons because the founder of the Norfolk Initiative for Chess Excellence, also known as NICE, wants to make sure the players return, so she and the other mentors make it fun.
Now there's only one woman on this whole chessboard, and that's the queen, right? Guess what? One woman on the board.
NICE founder Lisa Suhe says the idea is to raise a child's critical thinking skills.
We're trying to help kids think and look 2 or 3 moves ahead. Instead of just spending their thought time reacting to everything, have them spend some time looking at all the possibilities, because it's important to the way they learn in school. If a kid plays chess before they even start school, they develop that kind of patience, that tenacity to look around for the solutions, and they test better. Pieces. Can you guess why this one is the only one that can jump over other pieces?
Because it has a horse.
Because it has a horse. What's your name? Kids who play chess once a week for a year can almost double their standardized test scores without doing anything other than playing chess. And that's pretty much because it makes them consider all the possibilities and slow down and take their time.
6-year-old Khalil Lavelle is a huge fan of the game.
And I like chess because when I play with it, it makes me better at playing it. And when I play it, it's like my brain gets smarter.
So I asked Khalil to give me a quick overview of some of the chess pieces and what you can do with them.
These are the pawns. They can only move here or twice, and they can move diagonal. Somebody's right there. And this is the king. He can only move it when he's in check. Then he moves. And this is the queen. They can move anywhere they want.
When NICE meets, some are there to learn, some to play, and others to mentor. Tim Anderson has been sharing his knowledge of the game with the kids for about 5 months now.
We just try to make it fun for them more than anything else because they'll learn. They learn best from each other. So what I try to do with this is just make certain that they know that they're making legal moves. Our mission is not to teach them chess like proper chess. We can teach that to older kids. It's to make chess fun. Because they're not going to learn it if it's not fun for them. They've got plenty other games to play.
NICE welcomes children as young as age 5, and some continue through their teens.
Think of it this way. If this was the White House, and this was President Obama, and these were terrorists.
9-year-old Imani Owens is a newcomer to the game, but already loves it.
I like bonding with other people and how you just get to have fun while you're playing it.
The free lessons take place at 2 locations, the Lamberts Point Community Center on Wednesdays from 4 until 6, and the Pretlow Library in Ocean View on Sundays from 2:30 until 4:30. But NICE is eager to expand and hopes to raise enough money to convert the old train station on 26th Street in Villa Heights into a place where children can learn chess and participate in science, technology, engineering, and math, or STEM workshops. For Another View,
If you go back,
I'm Lisa Godley.
Play again. I call it rematch.
And that's a fabulous program. If you're interested, please get involved. Time now for things to view and do in Hampton Roads.
Be my Saturday love.
Hampton Roads Gazette magazine invites you to come to their Community Pulse event on Tuesday, September 4th, 5:30 to 7:30 at Piccadilly Cafeteria on Military Highway in Norfolk. Hampton Roads Gazette focuses on the great works of nonprofit organizations in our community. Come share what your group is doing to make Hampton Roads a great place to live, work, worship, and play. Visit hrgazzetti.com for more information. Play an instrument? The Hampton Roads Metro Band wants to hear from you, particularly if you play French horn, clarinet, percussion, or trumpet. This is an all-volunteer band, ages 18 to 80 and above. First rehearsal for this year is Monday, September 10th at 7 at the Oakland United Methodist Church on Indian River Road in Chesapeake. Call 252-435-6169 to find out more. You're invited to attend a free screening of the award-winning documentary Age of Champions, a touching and humorous behind-the-scenes look at 5 senior competitors as they go for the gold at the National Senior Games. The screening is Thursday, September 13th at 11 at the Sandler Center, Market Street in Virginia Beach. Call area code 252-221-4717 for details. And if you're into gardening, then this next event is for you. It's the Turnover a New Leaf Fall Gardening Festival on Saturday, September 15th from 10 until 3 at the Hampton Roads Agricultural Research and Extension Center, Diamond Springs Road in Virginia Beach. The event and parking are free. Call 468-3865 with questions. And finally, this holiday weekend, do something special so that others may live. Roll up your sleeve and donate blood to the American Red Cross. Supplies are down and the Red Cross needs your help. All blood types are needed. Call 1-800-RED-CROSS to find a donation drive near you. These and other events are on our website, anotherviewradio.org. And if you want to listen to today's show again or check out past podcasts of Another View, go to anotherviewradio.org and click Stream Episode. Every podcast of Another View is located on our website, so go visit often. Next Friday, we'll talk about the future of Norfolk Public Schools with Superintendent Dr. Samuel King, School Board Chair Dr. Kurt Houston, Principal Kevin Monroe, and Tidewater Community College Provost Dr. Marvin Bright. MPS and TCC have an exciting new initiative, and you'll get the details next Friday at noon. For producer Lisa Godley, audio engineer Brian Hughes, filling in for Perry Smith, Danny Epperson, who answered the phones, I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Enjoy this holiday weekend, stay safe, and let's get together again next Friday at noon for Another View.